Every generation needs a new revolution. That's a powerful quote from Thomas Jefferson, isn't it?
It really is.
And it kind of sets the stage perfectly for our deep dive today. We're going to take a close, maybe unvarnished look at the foundational document of the United States, the Constitution.
Hmm.
Our mission, really, is to explore its origins, understand its historical limitations, look at the challenges it faces now in the 21st century.
Right.
And then maybe the boldest part, imagine what a truly renewed Constitution could look like.
And our main guide for this journey is a really compelling book, A New Constitution, A New America, by Dr. Ryan Vaidya.
Okay.
Dr. Vaidya, he's a Fulbright specialist, written a lot on contemporary social issues. And I think it's important to stress his book isn't, some partisan manifesto.
Right, not trying to tear it all down.
Exactly. It's
Right.
not a rejection of the American experiment. It's more of a deeply researched call to really understand it, question it, and maybe improve it. His argument essentially is that it wasn't designed to serve everyone equally from the start. And, well, today, it often serves too few.
Mm-hmm.
The book really tries to expose what he calls the fault lines in American democracy, things like representation, the influence of money, judicial power.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that then. We all know the famous start to the preamble, we the people.
Right.
It sounds so inclusive, so grand. But when you really dig into who actually counted as the people back in 1787, what does that picture look like?
Well, it's a pretty stark contrast to that ideal, actually. The Constitution was forged by a very narrow elite.
How narrow?
We're talking predominantly white men who
Oh.
owned property.
Mm.
And quite a few of them were slaveholders. If you look at the first census around 1790, fewer than 10% of the population had full political rights.
Wow, less than 10%.
White, male property owners. That was the group.
Think about that for a second. Less than 1 in 10 adults actually had a political voice. It completely changes how you read We the People, doesn't it? So who was specifically left out then?
Oh, the exclusions were profound and explicit. Women, completely excluded. Enslaved black Americans, who were about 18% of the population, then had zero rights.
Zero.
Zero. But, and this is crucial, through the infamous 3/5 compromise, they were counted as 3/5 of a person.
Right, for representation purposes.
Exactly. Which inflated the political power of the southern states, but gave absolutely no rights or humanity to the enslaved people themselves. And of course, indigenous peoples were also excluded.
So you have to ask, was this just an oversight, like they forgot? Or was it a deliberate choice to keep so many people out?
Oh, it was absolutely a deliberate choice, no question.
Really?
Yeah, it was rooted in this prevailing belief at the time that only property owners have the stake in society, the wisdom, whatever, to have a say. It effectively concentrated political power among the economic elite.
And you can see that in the structure itself, right? Like the Senate.
Precisely. The original design of the senators chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote, that was specifically designed to insulate it from, popular opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It favored elite control. And that system, it lasted for over 100 years.
Until the 17th Amendment.
Right, 1913, mandated direct election. But for a long time, it was an indirect system.
That's such a critical detail. It really highlights how deep that concentration of power went, which makes you wonder, were there other models around then, perhaps more representative ideas that they just ignored?
Well, it's fascinating because North America wasn't some empty land. It had this incredibly rich and diverse history of native nations.
Right.
Flourishing for, at least 15,000 years, with sophisticated cultures, political systems, deep ecological knowledge.
Can you give us an example of those systems?
Yeah. Take the Mississippian culture. They thrived from about 800 to 1600 CE in the eastern woodlands, known for these complex urban centers, huge earthen mounds, like Cahokia.
Cahokia near modern St. Louis.
Exactly. At its peak, around 1100 CE, Cahokia was huge. Estimated population 10,000 to 20,000 people. That was larger than London at the time.
Wow. Larger than London in North America.
Imagine that. Centuries before Columbus.
Yeah.
It shows this incredible, often overlooked sophistication. Their societies were complex chiefdoms, often matrilineal, meaning lineage traced through the mother's side.
Remarkable. Any other examples?
Yeah, another really powerful one is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. You might know them as the Iroquois. Formed sometime between the 12th and 16th centuries, traditionally. Their Great Law of Peace, the Guyana-Shagoa. It was this really sophisticated democratic system
So.
based on consensus, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, all passed down through oral tradition and intricate wampum belts.
And some founders knew about this, right?
They did. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, he actually acknowledged the Haudenosaunee influence on the thinking of the American colonists. And much later, in 1987, the U.S. Senate even formally acknowledged this contribution in a resolution.
So the knowledge was there. It was recognized, at least by some, but ultimately it wasn't incorporated. What was the consequence of ignoring that?
Well, the consequence was pretty profound. The U.S. basically overlooked, dismissed, and failed to incorporate this deep local wisdom. It led to a disregard for indigenous sovereignty, obviously, but it also meant the American system started out quite one-sided, you know?
Yeah. Okay, let's sort of fast forward to today then. How do these original structures, these deliberate exclusions from the 18th century, how do they still impact our democracy now in the 21st century? Let's maybe start with executive power. How much power can one person really wield?
That's a huge question, especially lately. Recent presidencies, particularly Trump's, really highlighted the, let's call it the elasticity and potential overreach of executive authority.
How so? What kind of examples does the book give?
Well, things like the travel bans targeting mainly Muslim countries, imposing extensive trade tariffs without explicit okay from Congress, declaring national emergencies for controversial policies like the border wall.
Right, using emergency powers.
Exactly. These kinds of unilateral actions showed how easily norms could potentially be pushed aside. And remember the use of acting officials.
Oh yeah, bypassing Senate confirmation.
Right, sort of exploiting constitutional loopholes.
Right.
And there was even talk, you might recall, about this hypothetical Schedule F mass firings idea.
What was that again?
The proposal was to reclassify tens of thousands of career civil servants, making them essentially at-will employees.
So they could be fired for political reasons.
Potentially, yes. It would fundamentally undermine the idea of a nonpartisan federal workforce.
That's a really potent example of how executive power could potentially expand. What about the judicial branch then? The framers gave judges lifetime tenure, right? The idea was independence. But the book argues it's become something else, entrenchment. How does it square that original intent with today's reality?
Well, a key point the book makes is that lifetime tenure back then was partly pragmatic. Well, in the late 18th century, there weren't formal law schools like today. Legal training was apprenticeship-based, so there was a limited pool of qualified people.
Okay. So lifetime appointments helped ensure you had experienced judges.
Exactly. It helped secure expertise and stability. But now, with modern medicine, justices are serving much, much longer, 25, 35 years, sometimes more. Think Justice Douglas or Justice Thomas.
Right. Decades.
And that incredible longevity has transformed Supreme Court appointments into these incredibly high-stakes, hyper-partisan battles.
Yeah, you can certainly see that.
So the argument is it leads more to entrenchment now rather than just independence.
It's almost like multiple lifetimes on the court sometimes. No wonder the fights are so intense. But, okay, while that entrenchment issue is clear, does the book acknowledge the classic argument for lifetime tenure, that it still protects judges from political wins, ensures unpopular but necessary decisions can be made?
Oh, yes, it acknowledges the historical intent for independence.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the book's position is that the practical reality of this extreme longevity now kind of outweighs that original benefit.
How so?
Well, the sheer length of modern terms means a single appointment can shape the law for literally decades, maybe far longer than the framers ever imagined, or, arguably, what's healthy for a democracy that needs to adapt. And because there's no regular turnover, it just seems to amplify the political polarization around every single nomination.
Right. Okay, and what about money in politics? We hear so much about that. It often feels like a real crisis of representation.
Yeah, and if you connect this back, the constitutional framework, you could argue, hasn't really evolved to deal with this modern form of, well, exclusion or undue influence money in politics.
And court decisions play a big role here.
A huge role.
Yeah.
Key interpretations,
Yeah.
like Buckley-Valeo back in '76. The decision struck down limits on campaign spending, essentially saying spending money on campaigns is a form of protected speech. And then more recently, Citizens United in 2010. That ruling said corporations have First Amendment rights to spend unlimited amounts on politics.
So how does the U.S. system compare to other democracies on this? Are we an outlier?
In many ways, yes. Most other established democracies approach this very differently.
Like where?
Well, Germany, for instance. Political equality is actually seen as a constitutional duty. They have public financing, strict limits on corporate money, anonymous donations.
Just a...
The UK has strict spending limits for candidates and parties. Canada's courts say reasonable limits on spending are okay to protect political equality, even with freedom of expression. France relies heavily on public funding, bans money from private organizations. They focus on the sincerity of elections.
So the U.S. Constitution, it doesn't explicitly guarantee political equality in that sense.
Not explicitly, no. And that silence, combined with those key judicial interpretations, has allowed wealth to gain this, really outsized role in American politics.
Okay. Beyond money, what other sort of structural barriers does the book point to that undermine democracy today?
There are several big ones it highlights. First, gerrymandering.
Ah, yes, drawing district lines.
Exactly. State legislatures drawing congressional district lines, often to lock in power for one party. It creates these safe seats, dilutes the impact of votes. Basically lets politicians choose their voters, not the other way around.
Okay, what else?
Second, the Electoral College.
Always controversial.
Always. Yeah. The fact that a candidate can win the presidency without winning the popular vote, which has happened multiple times, right? 1824, 1876, 1888, 2020, 16.
Right.
It disproportionately empowers smaller states, and many argue violates the basic principle of one person, one vote.
And the third barrier?
The difficulty of actually changing the Constitution, Article V, the amendment process.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard.
It requires 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. It makes formal amendment nearly impossible, as the book puts it. I mean, the last broadly relevant amendment was ratified back in 1971.
Wow. So timely reforms often just get blocked.
Pretty much.
Now, the book uses this phrase, the dead horse theory. It sounds quite provocative. What does Dr. Baidu mean by that?
Yeah, the dead horse theory. It's the metaphor, right?
Right.
It's about recognizing when a fundamental problem needs a radical rethink of the whole approach, not just tinkering around the edges.
Okay.
The idea is if you're trying harder and harder, but the problem persists, maybe the issue isn't your effort. Maybe the fundamental approach itself is, well, the dead horse.
So stop trying to write it.
Exactly. Just mount and find a new path. So things like lifetime judicial tenure, which we talked about,
Yeah.
or even the fact that Constitution still uses gendered language like he.
Right.
These are presented as examples of maybe clinging to outdated solutions when systemic change might be what's actually needed.
That's a really powerful way to frame it, because when you think about it, a framework designed in 1789, the world is just fundamentally different now. So why is a full-blown renewal actually necessary, according to the book?
Well, the changes are just staggering. Look at demographics alone. 1789. About 3.9 million people in the U.S., 95% rural, mostly European descent.
Okay.
Fast forward to 2025, we're around 340 million people, 83% urban, incredibly diverse, no single majority ethnic group anymore.
That's a massive shift.
Huge. And societal transformation, just as dramatic. 18th century. Manual labor, slow communication, limited healthcare. 21st century. Digital automation, instant global communication, revolutionary medicine.
Yeah, it's a completely different world.
Completely.
Yeah.
So a framework designed for that first era, it just struggles to cope with the realities of this era. And that struggle, the book argues, leads to these persistent political fights, public frustration. Think about the Senate's disproportionate power, the endless electoral college debates.
Right. So let's play the what-if game. Imagine we could start fresh, really reimagine the Constitution for this new America. What might that look like?
Well, the book explores this idea of drafting a constitution with genuine inclusivity from the outset, embracing indigenous wisdom, women's perspectives, the aspirations of common laborers.
How would that even start, like the preamble?
Yeah, the book proposes a spirit for a new preamble, something like, we, the diverse peoples inhabiting these united lands, the First Nations, who have stewarded this continent for millennia, recognizing our interconnectedness, our shared dependence on the balance of nature, and our profound responsibility to future generations.
Wow, that's a very different tone.
It signals a really profound shift, right? Away from ownership, more towards stewardship and reciprocity.
That philosophical shift is huge. But let's get practical. What kind of structural changes does the book propose for a renewed framework?
It outlines a pretty bold 5-branch framework.
5 branches, okay.
Yeah. First, the legislative branch, called the Grand Council. It would aim for full representation using multi-layered proportional representation, meaning seats allocated more closely to the actual vote share parties get. It would include dedicated representation for First Nations. Use independent commissions for redistricting, not politicians.
Okay, taking gerrymandering off the table.
Right. And term limits, like maybe a 24-year lifetime cap on national elected office, except for the president.
Okay, branch 1. What's 2?
Executive branch. A single Non-renewable 6-year term for the president and VP,
6 years, non-renewable.
elected by direct national popular vote. And get this, a runoff election is mandatory if no candidate gets over 50%. Not just of votes cast, but of registered voters,
Including non-voters.
including non-voters, and none of the above votes counting towards that threshold. Forces candidates to really engage everyone. Also, individual presidential pardons, abolished. That power would go to a Truth and Reconciliation Committee instead.
Interesting. Branch 3, the judiciary.
Judicial branch. Single, non-renewable terms for federal judges. Maybe 12 years for the Supreme Court, 16 for others.
No more lifetime tenure.
Gone. Selection would be transparent, done by an independent, peer-driven commission, and cases assigned randomly to panels to stop judge shopping. Also, no immunity for judicial misconduct.
Okay, that's 3 branches. What are the other 2? They're new.
Fourth is a Civic Oversight Commission, an elected body, but its job is to be a watchdog. It would have subpoena power, audit power, constitutionally empowered oversight.
Like an independent accountability branch.
Sort of, yeah. At fifth, a National Education and Knowledge Commission, its role. To protect civic learning, historical truth, independent research. Basically ensure an informed citizenry protected as a core function of government.
5 branches. That's certainly a big departure. These are huge changes. Does the book talk about the challenges? I mean, the risks of maybe overcomplicating things or just the sheer difficulty of implementing something so different?
Oh, absolutely. The book definitely acknowledges that any shift, this fundamental, would face enormous hurdles. Overcoming political inertia, outright resistance, plus just the huge logistical complexity of transitioning. It doesn't paint it as easy. But it frames these challenges as, well, necessary if we're serious about tackling the deep systemic issues. The argument is that the current system, with its rigidity and loopholes, is already creating massive governance problems.
So the complexity is maybe aimed at creating more checks and balances.
Exactly. Distributing power more broadly, introducing new checks, ultimately aiming for a system that's actually more resilient and responsive, even if it looks more complex on paper.
And what about basic rights and duties? How would those be defined in this reimagined Constitution?
Well, this new framework would explicitly spell out constitutional rights to things like adequate food and clean water, comprehensive health care, adequate shelter, a clean and sustainable environment.
So positive rights, not just negative liberties.
Exactly. Also, rights related to the modern world. Digital autonomy, privacy, platform neutrality, the right to know the truth about national history and governance.
And duty.
Yes, corresponding civic duties would also be explicit. The duty to vote, to perform civic service like jury duty, pay fair taxes, respect others' rights, and actively participate in protecting the environment and democratic institutions.
What about economic issues? Economic justice? That seems like a major fault line now.
Definitely. The book tackles that head on. It proposes a constitutionally mandated progressive wealth tax on the ultra-rich.
Mandated in the Constitution itself?
Yes, with the revenue specifically earmarked to fund those constitutional rights, education, healthcare, housing. It also suggests a universal basic income floor for all citizens.
UBI.
Yeah, coupled with a right to employment at a living wage, with the government acting as an employer of last resort if needed.
And campaign finance?
A total ban on corporate money, PAYEX money, any non-individual contributions, replaced entirely by robust public financing for campaigns.
So this is clearly designed as a living document, but how would this new system ensure it stays relevant, avoid becoming rigid like the current one?
That's a key feature. It proposes a mandatory constitutional review convention every 20 years.
Every 20 years, how would that work?
It would be composed mainly of randomly chosen citizens, say 99 voting members, like a giant citizens' assembly, plus some non-voting expert guardians, maybe 9 retired judges or scholars to advise.
So a built-in refresh mechanism.
Exactly. A structured, predictable process to re-examine the Constitution, update it, keep it responsive to the times, rather than waiting centuries for amendments or relying solely on judicial interpretation.
Wow. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the Constitution's origins, its present-day struggles, and these really bold ideas for its future. It really drives home that the journey of we the people, it's still very much ongoing, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
The current Constitution, it's endured, no doubt. But it was clearly designed for a vastly different world, and it's facing some serious headwinds in the 21st century.
Indeed. And maybe to bring it back to Jefferson, and that quote about the living generation having the right to direct its own affairs, it really makes you think, what does it truly mean for you, for us, the living, to actually possess that ultimate sovereign power, that consent, in a modern republic? And maybe more importantly, what role do you play, do we all play, in making sure that our governing framework continues to evolve?